Good evening to one and all present here. We at Nyaya Shastram provides and promote the e-learning platform for the law students and the legal fraternity. I would say we organize different types of competitions and webinars and give a platform to the legal fraternity to express their thought in the form of article that we publish on our blog. Today we are here to get the insights and overview of real estate laws in India. It gives me immense pleasure to have among with us for today's session Advocate Ms. Utkarsa Nikam. Ma'am has been working as an associate with the real estate team of Kanga and Company after graduating from Government Law College, Mumbai. She regularly advises clients in relation to real estate transactions and property disputes. She has developed a deep domain in relation to transactional documentation and title due diligences, realizing the dearth of content relating to real estate laws and the irrational fear in minds of young lawyers and law students towards the real estate practice. Ma'am co-founded the Indian Real Estate Law blog to demystify real estate law for such young lawyers and law students. She truly believes in giving back to the students in every little way possible, and she has been instrumental in conducting various webinars to share her deep knowledge regarding real estate laws and also providing guidance regarding the same to building lawyers and law students. She also mentors several students, run organizations, blogs, and research platforms across the country. Now I would like to request ma'am to start the lecture.
Thank you so much, Abhishek. A very good evening to one and all present here. So to begin with today's topic, I'll be speaking about the various real estate laws in India. Now, to begin the session, it's very essential for us to understand the meaning of real estate. Now, real estate sector in general is a very large, huge and diversified sector with different verticals, which we may call as that land or construction, development, investment, leading, etc. Now, for example, to put it in a simple words, if I say there is a vacant land and there are a lot of residential plots, houses, buildings, decks, trees, etc. around that particular land. So what do we consider as a real estate is the vacant land along with the residential plots, the trees, the fixtures, furnitures in and around. So the whole property will qualify as a real estate. So now real estate means in general terms to develop the land or to construct the land in relation to a very particular property that is an immovable property. Moving ahead, now to understand there are different Indian real estate segments, for example, residential, wherein we give out the rent agreements or wherein we buy and sell a particular flat or a property where we can reside in. Commercial, talking about commercial, it means various businesses give out their property on lease, leave and license for them to operate from their particular property. So they come into the commercial head. Then we have retail, hospitality, logistics, etc. Not going too much deep into it. First, we need to understand that we'll be talking about the property known as the immovable property here. Now, what is an immovable property? The Transfer of Property Act does not very clearly state the definition of an immovable property. It only says that the property does not include standing timber, growing crops and grass. Now, we will be referring to the Act of Indian Registration Act 1908. In that, Section 26 specifies the property immovable property definition, which says that it includes land, building, hereditary allowances, rights to ways, lights, ferries, fisheries, or any other benefit to arise out of land and things attached to the earth or permanently fastened to anything which is attached to the earth. But it excludes three main components which we had seen in the Transfer of Property Act as well. That is the standing timber, growing crops and grass. While transfer of property deals with the immovable property and movable property, we will be specifically talking about the immovable property. For us to move ahead, I'll be using certain terms which are very prominent in the field of real estate or in general parlance as well. So it is very important for us to understand the meaning behind it. However, there are a lot of important terms which a layman or a law student or any person in general should have a knowledge of. I have picked up a few important terms which we hear in general day-to-day parlance. Now, talking about the carpet era, What do we know as carpet area? When we go to buy a particular space or a plot, we always ask what is the carpet area, what is the chargeable area. To understand in a very simple terms, carpet area is the actual usable area of an apartment or an office unit or a showroom minus the wall thickness. So simply put, it is the area within the walls wherein you can actually lay down a carpet. Moving ahead, build-up area. To understand the concept of built-up area, it is carpet area plus area of the walls, which was initially excluded in the definition of carpet area, or if there is area of balcony or terrace. Now we can understand it in a very simplified area with this diagram, in which we can see the black color portion is the wall area, whereas the yellow color portion is the carpet area. And carpet area plus the wall area equals to the built-up area. Moving ahead, we need to understand what does the term clear title mean. Now, a clear title is a title without any type of lien or levy from the creditors or other parties that would pose a question as to the legal ownership. Now, to understand in the layman terms, now we come across a lot of papers wherein we say that the property is clear and marketable. That means the person posing to be the owner of the property, he is actually the owner of the property. The property is not mortgaged, does not have any kind of liens on it. Because, for example, when I go to a particular store to buy a toy, if I'm buying that toy, that means that I'm paying the money for that particular commodity, if I'm saying. So I want that commodity to belong to me after making the payment. If someone else comes into picture and says, no, this does not belong to you, because that particular person who sold the commodity to you does not have the legal rights of that commodity. So same as with the property, when you're investing so much huge amount of money, you of course want to have a clear and marketable title with respect to any property which you will own. Moving ahead, due diligence. Now, how do we understand if a property is clear and marketable? That is with the process of due diligence. Now, in real estate transactions, due diligence happens to be a very vital step in the home buying or, any commercial or hospitality aspect. Now, what happens is in due diligence, in real estate transactions, it refers to a reasonable measures which every individual should adopt before executing an agreement in relation to that particular property or plot of land, etc. Because it's like you have if I want to sell a property to you, your first question should be, please provide me all the documents which hold the chain of title of the documents and which also qualify that you are the present current owner of that property. You can hear a lot of cases going on in courts wherein, people try selling the property which they do not belong to that particular person, and they'll end up into a lot of litigation, pending litigation, and the property is locked. Why? Because the buyer should be diligent in his own survey that the property is, first of all, diligently seen all the property papers and also has a clear and marketable title. Moving ahead, title search. Now, since a title search is a part of the due diligence process, it means that the examination of all the public records to determine and confirm a property's legal ownership and find out what claims are there, if any. Like, for example, claims as in the mortgages or lien on the property. Letter of intent. Now, what happens is when two parties negotiate to buy or sell a particular property, there are two parties involved. So they want to come on a mutual understanding and record that mutual understanding. Because what happens is, if I agree to sell a particular property for X amount, tomorrow it shouldn't happen that the other person wakes up and tell me, you did not say X, you said Y. So it's always beneficial to record the mutual understanding which is arrived at between two parties, and we do by the way of letter of intent. It is also kind of similar to the term sheet, but both are different variables and we are not going to get into it. Now, no objection certificate. Now, there are different NOCs, completion certificate, commencement certificates, which are involved in the process of due diligencing a property or seeing the title of that property. Now, these certificates come from different authorities. For example, if we talk about the completion certificate, it is come from the appropriate authority that this building plan is approved. These are the conditions, and the builder can commence the particular construction with respect to that particular land. Now, NOC is now what happens is it is a legal document which is either what do we say? It is a legal document which is issued from a particular government department or appropriate authority to clear any legal objections that might have, already arisen due to the regarding the construction of that particular property. Now, property card, this is a very common term, but people usually get a lot of confusion between the property card and also the 712 extract. Now, property card is also referred to as the Malmatta Patrak. To put it in simply words, it means it provides the information about the ownership of a property and history of holding of land located in the urban areas. But whereas when we talk about the 712 extract, that is the Sat Para Utara, which is again a very important document in due diligencing, or we ask to determine who is the holder of that particular property now, is a record of land property but in the rural areas. Now, 712 extract contains the various different information about the ownership of the property, the type and the purpose of the land, etc. Now, it mainly deals with the areas that are outside the city limits. Moving ahead, now when we speak about the real estate laws of India, now, of course, if there's a property involved, there has to be some laws that regulate the sale, transfer, purchase of that particular land or movable property in a particular area. Here we'll be talking about the immovable property. Now, the real estate laws, what are they? They are the rules and regulations that regulate every aspect of a real estate property transaction. Now, there are so many intricate requirements are involved in every real estate transaction. For example, if you say leasing, selling, transfer, or a foreclosure of a property. Now, why do we need them? Because, they kind of put in place to safeguard the rights in the property which is either purchased, sold, or leased. Now, there are different issues which are covered under real estate, as I mentioned. They can be, for example, preparing a plan or monitoring a construction of a real estate site, drafting deeds and contracts for real estate transactions, even FEMA, FERA, but we wouldn't be going into that aspect. Moving ahead, talking about the Indian Contract Act 1872. Now, contract, as we know, it is an agreement between two or more persons which the law will enforce. Now, according to section 2H, the term contract means an agreement which is enforceable by law. Now, according to section 2E, every promise and every set of promises forming the consideration for each other is an agreement. Now, what happens is generally the real estate transactions begin initially with an agreement between the two parties, because one has to either sell the property and the other has to buy the property. Now, the legislation specifies when a property can be said to have the capacity to contract. Now, a contract pertaining to real estate can be entered into either by an individual who is not a minor or of unsound mind, or partners of a firm, a corporate body, a trust, sole corporation, the manager of an undivided Hindu family, or even a foreigner. Like, there is no ambit or any restriction with respect to the parties in which capacity they are entering into. Of course, the name clause will have different variations, but any person who qualifies to be capable of entering into a contract is capable of entering into it. Now, all the requirements of the valid contract, that is the consideration, intention to contract, and the validity under the law of the land must be satisfied. Now, as mentioned earlier, capacity of the parties to enter into a contract is a very essential component here, because it is now which parties. Now, Section 11, if we see, of the Indian Contract Act, elaborates on the issue by providing that a person who has not attained the age of a majority, is of unsound mind, and is disqualified from entering into a contract by any law to which he is subject, should be should be considered not a competent party to enter into any contract or agreement per se. Now, essentials to make a contract. A contract forms the basis of any real estate transaction because the two parties will be determining or laying down their rights, liabilities, obligations under the contract, like recording the mutual understanding between the two people. Now, for understanding the essential, there must be two or more parties. There must be offer and acceptance. One must have made the offer, the other person must have accepted the offer. There has to be identity of minds. For example, they should agree upon the same subject matter. Consideration, because there has to be a consideration when we talk about the contract. Capacity, we have seen section 11, which parties are not competent to contract. Free consent should be there. Lawful consideration should be there along with the consideration, and the legality of the object. That means that it should be recognized and approved by the society. Moving ahead, transfer of property plays a major role while determining the nature of the liabilities which are imposed upon the parties, the rights and obligations under them, again depending upon the set of transaction. But now Transfer of Property Act, as I said earlier, the property is classified into two parts. One is movable, the other one is immovable. The Transfer of Property Act 1882 now mainly deals with the transfer of the immovable property. Now, it does not apply to the transfers by any operation of law or any such transfer of immovable property which is necessitated by an order of court. For example, forfeiture on insolvency, we can take that as for example. Now, understanding there are different kind of transfer which happens under Section 6 of the Transfer of Property Act. Now, the Act deals with the transfers of property by an act of parties like sales of immovable property, mortgages, charges, leases, etc. Now, according to Section 6, the property of any kind of can be transferred. How? Sale, mortgage, lease, exchange, and gift. Now, these are the sections which contain, with respect to lease, mortgage, sale, transfer. We would be talking about 4 kinds of transfer, which is elaborated under Section 6. Sale, according to Section 54, sale is a transfer of ownership in exchange for a price paid or promised or part paid and part promised. Sale, which we are assuming we are aware of the concept. Moving ahead, understanding mortgages. It is defined under Section 58. It is a mortgage is the transfer of an interest in specific immovable property for the purpose of securing the payment of money advance or to be advanced by way of loan and existing or future debt or the performance of an engagement that may give rise to a pecuniary liability. Moving ahead, now we know there are mortgage deeds in place. The transferor is called a mortgager and the transferee is called a mortgagee. Now, the principal money and the interest of which the payment is secured for the time being, I'll call the mortgage money, and the instrument by which the transfer is happening, if any, is called the mortgage deed. We come across these documents when we are referring or when we are doing the due diligence of a property or when we are seeing the chain of the title documents. So for us, it is necessary to understand what a mortgage deed means. If a property is sold, what is an agreement for sale, agreement to sell, etc. Moving ahead, gift, lease. Now, according to Section 105, we know the definition of a lease of an immovable property is a transfer of a right to enjoy such property made for a certain time. It can be either express or it can be either implied or in perpetuity in consideration of a price paid or promised or of money, a share of crop, service or any other thing of value to be rendered periodically or on specified occasions to the transferor by the transferee who accepts the transfer on such terms. A lot of people get confused between the concept called as lease and lienal license. We'll be talking further the differences between them as well. Now here, when we understand and when we are referring to a lease deed, the transferor here is called a lessor and the transferee is called a lessee. We need to understand that there is a interest, like transfer of the interest in an immovable property when we are talking about lease, whereas there is no transfer of an interest in an immovable property when we talk about the leave and license agreement. Now, gift. Section 122 defines the gift. A gift is a very common mode of transfer of property. It is the transfer of certain existing movable or immovable property which is made by one person to another. Now the transfer should be made voluntarily and without consideration. Like the definition itself speaks about the essentials that are required to make gift under TOPA valid. Then we talk about the person who is transferring the gift is called a donor. The person who is accepting the gift is called a donee. And it is very essential that the donee must accept the property during the lifetime of the donor and while he is still capable of giving. So in case the donee dies before acceptance, the gift is void. Indian Easements Act. Now this act is very essential to refer to basically because it deals with the easements and the license, the leave and license, which is very commonly used now. So we'll be calling here license. Easement is defined under Section 4 of the Easement Act, and it is an easement is a right which the owner or the occupier of certain land which he possesses as such for the beneficial enjoyment of the land, to do or continue to do something, or to prevent and continue to prevent something being done in or upon or in respect of certain other land and not his own. Now, basically, it provides that the right one owner enjoys to its benefit over the land owned by the other is known to be an easement. Moving ahead, we will briefly touch upon the different types of easement. Easement is divided into continuous and discontinuous easement. Continuous easement is the one whose enjoyment may be continued without the intervention of any human conduct or act of a man, and there is no interference of man, and that is particularly adds to the speciality of the continuous easement. When we talk about the discontinuous easement, that means an human intervention of a man is required. Further, discontinuous easement is divided into two different easements. One is apparent and the second is non-apparent. Apparent easement is something which is very visible. For example, a drain pipe passing from X land to Y land. And non-apparent easement is not very visible to the eyes. You need to either carry out an inspection or carrying out an inspection is the basic example to understand the non-apparent, because it is not visible directly. Also, there is this one more type, that is conditional easement, which is not recorded in the chart. Conditional easement is given basically on some conditions. If it is violated, then it reverts back to the owner. When we talk about license, now Section 52, one key point here I would like to notify is that lease is defined under Transfer of Property Act, whereas license is defined under Indian Easements Act. So a lot of people get confused. Don't get confused, because the concepts are also a little similar but different in nature. It depends upon the rights which are granted. Now, Section 52 of the Easements Act defines license. Now, to put it simply, basically it means to give the property to third person and imposing some restrictions on it. And it does not amount to the interest of the transfer in the property. Now, Section 52, when we talk about license specifically, it can be a unilateral grant which is unsupported by any consideration. Now, under license or under Section 52, there are certain following criteria which are involved in granting a leave and license to any particular person. Now, the owner of the property must grant or allow a person to a definite number of persons right to do or to continue to do something in the immovable property of the grantor. Now, the right which is vested in the grantee should not amount to an easement or an interest in the property. Interest in the property is a key factor which differentiates the leave and license from the lease. Now, who may grant the license? It's very simple. If I have the ownership of the property, I am the correct person to grant the license to a third person. In other words, to put it simply, a license cannot be granted by the licensor if he does not possess the lawful interest in the property, and the licensee cannot receive such a license. Now, here are the key differences between the leave-in license and the lease. License bear permission without any transfer of an interest in an immovable property in the lease. Leave-in license does not create an interest in the property, whereas lease creates an interest in the favor of the lessee with respect to that particular property. Neither transferable nor heritable. Lease both transferable and heritable. Leave-in license, it's come to an end with the death of either the grantor or the grantee. Lease, it does not come to an end either with the death of the grantor or grantee. Usually, if you want to see the name clause, you should see the name clause of the leave-in license agreement or a lease agreement. That would give you that if it is succeeded by its heirs or executors, or it's not succeeded by his heir or executor. Now, license, if the property is sold to a third party, it comes to an end immediately, whereas a lease is unaffected by the transfer of the property by sale in favor of a third party. License cannot defend his possession in his own name, as he does not have any proprietary right. A lessee has a right to protect the possession in his own right. Licensee is not entitled to any improvements or accessions made to the property. However, when the leave-in license agreement is drawn, there are some kind of structural changes with the permission of the licensor, or some alterations are made, but with the permission of the licensor, whereas a lessee is in the possession of the property is entitled to any improvements or accessions made to the property, but generally the clause is there that the lessor has to be intimidated or just put in view of the such changes which are required. Now, when we talk about the Registration Act of 1908, now, registration is, what is it? It is the process of recording a document with a recognized officer and to safeguard its original copies. When you see any agreement, a registration stamp would be there. Registration number is also there, which is written on the pauti or the first two pages of any agreement, which has a stamp duty pauti, or the pauti is there in the first page, wherein it will have the registration number of the document. Now, there is this website, IGR Maharashtra website, which is an online website. You can actually access all the documents which are registered with respect to any lands in Bombay. And it has a bifurcation. How do you identify it? When you have the registration number of any document, you put that into required specifications, that document will easily appear, because every document has a unique registration number and it is not repeated. So, moving ahead, now purpose of the Act. The purpose of the Registration Act, amongst the other things, is to provide a method of public registration of document so as to give information to people regarding legal rights and obligations arising or affecting a particular property, and to perpetuate documents which may afterwards be of legal importance, and also to prevent fraud. Now, registration lends inviolability and importance of certain classes of documents. Now, what happens is, if a document is not registered, there are different consequences that a party would have to face under law. So, we would not be dealing with it. I just wanted to give you an idea that the Registration Act of 1908 is an important document which has to, we need to understand the purpose of the same and why it is important. Now, the Registration Act governs property registrations in India. Now, registration is compulsory for documents of immovable property that is worth ₹100 or more. At the time of the registration, the buyer has to pay the stamp duty and registration charges. An unregistered sale deed will not be admissible as evidence in the court of law. A sale deed must be registered within 4 months of its execution. These are some key factors which we generally know of, but when we come to try to tell someone, or try to understand the concept, we miss on to it. So these are the key points amongst the others. Now, of course, registration is not compulsory on all the documents. There is always going to be bifurcation with respect to the documents which can be registered, which should be mandatory be registered, which are optional for the registration, or which the parties choose generally to get it registered for safeguarding the nature of the transaction. Now, Section 17 of the Indian Registration Act deals with the mandatory registration, and it provides for mandatory registration of certain documents which are as follows: gifted related to an immovable property or non-testamentary instrument. Now, sale, mortgages, other than by way of deposit of title deeds. When I'm talking of mortgages, I'm not talking about deposit of title deeds. And exchange of immovable property are required to be registered by virtue of the TOPA Act. Now, evidently, therefore, all the above documents which I mentioned have to be in writing. Yes, an unregistered document will not actually affect the party who is compromised in it, and nor be received as evidence in any transaction affecting such property, except as evidence of a contract in suit for a specific performance or a part performance. Now, under the TOPA, unless it has been registered. For example, what happens is it does not, Indian Evidence Act is also linked under real estate laws, because the evidentiary value of the particular document related to an immovable property can be determined using that particular act. So usually it is advisable to get the document registered, which will have evidentiary value in the court of law if per se, if any property dispute is happening in a civil court of law. So the reliability depends upon it. Now, Section 18 talks about the optional registration. As I said, two types would be there. One, mandatory. Second is optional. Which are the optional documents? Adoption deed, will, instrument related to shares in the joint stock company, agreement of mortgage, promissory note, etc. There's a long list. I have mentioned a few of them. Now, what happens at the registration center? We keep talking about the registration of a particular document is happening there. How it happens? Now, every person who is presenting a document for the registration shall affix his passport size photograph along with the fingerprints to the document. Now, this fingerprints and the passport size photograph is mandatory requirement in the signature clause. Now, in a case where the document related to the transfer of ownership of an immovable property, passport size photographs and the fingerprints of all the buyers and the sellers mentioned in the document should be affixed. Now, Indian Stamp Act. Again, the Indian Stamp Act determines the value that a particular document is to be executed on. Now, the basic purpose is to raise revenue to the government. The schedule to the act is deemed to be exhaustive and to be strictly consumed. Now, if you see the Indian Stamp Act, there is a schedule to that particular act in which different modes of instruments is written down, and the amount, the stamp duty which is levied on a particular type of document is also mentioned in the schedule. And the documents which are not mentioned in the schedule ideally are to be deemed to be excluded from the operation of the act. Coming to the main act, the Real Estate Regulation and Development Act 2016, which is very prominently known as RERA. Now, this act establishes a Real Estate Regulatory Authority, that is RERA, in each state for regulation of the real estate sector, and also acts as an adjudicating body for the speedy dispute resolution. Now, RERA is a central act. So this is a medium through which the union and this has entered into the state subjects like land. Now, one of the very primary reasons amongst the other reasons, RERA has been enacted to regulate the sale and transfer of flats between the promoter and the allottee. Now, I am very specifically using the terms known as promoter and allottee, and I think which you should also try, because RERA is very specific to the transaction relating to these two parties. One is promoter, second is allottee. Promoter is the developer or the person who is selling that particular building or flat, and allottee is the buyer in simple terms. Moving ahead now, what are the needs and objectives? Need, because transparency is there, accountability is there, and you have different legal remedies. And what is the objective? The objective is full disclosure. I don't know if you're aware of, but if you go on the RERA website, that is MahaRERA for Maharashtra very specifically, which I am speaking about, the developer or the promoter has to make an account, has to make full disclosures about the real estate project which he is intending to invest in. He has to also give a very specific timeline when the project is supposed to be completed. And there are also remedies under the act if the particular promoter is not sticking to the deadline. Then there is a procedure which is briefly discussed in the act, and also dispute resolution, because what happens if the promoter generally, everyone thinks that the builders do not give timely delivery of flats, which might be possible in some cases, but there are cases in which the allottee, after making the first installment, has refused to take the possession of that particular flat. So where these disputes go, the RERA very briefly, very exhaustively mentions about the lot of dispute resolutions, how to get the legal remedy. There are different officers. There is RERA authority, MahaRERA, appellate tribunal. Now, if you see the framework of RERA, these are the sections which it is divided in, and these are the provisions of the acts, which I'll be briefly talking about one or two main important sections which I feel. Now, if you know MOFA Act, that is the Maharashtra Ownership of Flat Act 1963. A lot of people have confusion if MOFA is still in place even after RERA came into existence. The answer is yes, because there has been no notification wherein MOFA has been repealed. So MOFA and RERA exist both simultaneously. Why was MOFA enacted? Earlier, there were a lot of, during the unprecedented times of 1963, tenancy, the concept of tenancy was very popular. So the objective of RERA and MOFA are same, but MOFA does not has a lot of ambiguous terms which RERA has come into place and brought things into place, and also defined some particular aspects of definitions. For example, garage is defined under Real Estate RERA Act, carpet area is defined under RERA, whereas MOFA does not include the definition. There have been a lot of ambiguities which are happening. Does other laws application is barred due to the existence of RERA? No. Other laws will also apply. So what happens is, the general question is, if I have to file a complaint, should I go to a consumer forum, should I go to a high court, civil court, or should I come to a RERA authority? Now, the RERA Act explicitly bars the person going to a civil court of law. But however, the consumer forum, which we call, is not a court. It is a tribunal, and tribunal is not excluded under the ambit of RERA Act. So either you can go to a consumer forum, or also you can file an application or complaint to the RERA authority. Now, what are the different kinds of projects RERA applies to? For that, we need to understand what is a real estate project. Now, from this definition of the real estate project, it is very pertinent to understand if the promoter does not have an intention to sell that particular plot, who is developing, reconstructing, or constructing for that matter, it would be excluded from that ambit of the real estate project. Now, there are different, simply put, if I am reconstructing a property, I am just doing a reconstruction of the property or a building, for example, and I don't intend to reduce some carpet area from the old flat system and make available some new plots for the new buyers. I'm simply reconstructing it. I do not have any intention to sell, so it wouldn't come under the ambit of the real estate project. Moving ahead, registration of the real estate project. Now, I'm not going to go into technical aspects of registration because RERA Act itself is a very exhaustive act. I'm just trying to give you a simple overview of some important parts. Now, primary step before advertisement. Now, when you register RERA projects which are not registered, which does not bear the registration number under RERA, are not valid. It is very important for a promoter or a developer to understand that the primary step is that you should first register and then only advertise. Now, the next question would be, can renovation, repairs, redevelopment can be construed as real estate projects? As I mentioned while telling you the concept of real estate project, it cannot, because I do not have any intention to sell, or I do not have any new allotment of an apartment plot or building. If I have, then yes, but the intention to sell is a very prominent factor which determines if a particular project is a real estate project or no. Now, there are different phase-wise registrations. What do you mean by phase-wise registration? Now, if you see XYZ project is developing in Malad, for example. So, the project is so huge, they always have different wings. No one, usually nowadays, the developers have different A wing, B wing, C wing. So, the developer or the promoter does not immediately register A wing, B wing, C wing. No, he goes A wing, he invests into A wing, a little bit of construction is done, then he moves ahead to the B wing. But the A wing, which he construed, B wing, which he will be constructing ahead, are two different real estate projects. That is called a phase-wise registration. The project is whole, but the different phases are also involved in, for example, if I'm constructing a building of 10 stories, I would get my first, second, third, fourth, fifth floors registered, whereas I'll think of registering 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 later on. Now I am under the law valid to only sell or advertise first, second, third, fourth, fifth floors, because I have registered only that, and that would be construed as a phase-wise registration. Now, duration and validity of the grant of registration project. Now, when a particular person is registering, for example, he also mentions how long is the project gonna take. He has to mention how long is the project gonna take. There are other supporting documents which will evidence whatever he is claiming. So there are different law procedures which are given under the Act. But generally, to understand if someone is, the idea is if someone is granting you the validity or the duration to develop a certain project, he can also revoke the grant of the registration of the real estate project. Because what if the promoter is carrying out unfair trade practice? What if the promoter is exploiting the consumers without even registering the project? So there are different remedies which are involved. Now, there are different, laws, there are different duties of the promoter as well as the allottee as well. I mentioned earlier that what happens if the allottee refuses to take the possession of his apartment. Now, in this case of Platinum Properties, it was observed that pursuant to the receipt of the occupancy certificate is issued when your flat is completely constructed, and that buyer can take legal possession of that particular flat. So once the occupancy certificate is issued, which is known as OC, a buyer can shift into the flat, like he can function in that flat, like completely shift. So what had happened is, in this particular project, the buyer refused to take the possession even after issuing the occupancy certificate. Now, installments were done, remaining installments were remaining. Now, what was the condition for him to refuse was that the common amenities, for example, stairs, lifts, lights, which we call in that particular area, so they were not yet installed, because since the project was very huge, it was going to happen, but it was going to take some time. But under law, the rule is like once OC is issued, the allottee can take the possession of the apartment. Now, the authority ruled out that the allottee cannot refuse to take the possession of the apartment just because the construction of the common amenity is not completed. Because since the project is huge, it is going to take some time, but OC is issued because all the compliances with respect to that particular apartment are done. When can an allottee refuse to take the possession of an apartment? If the promoter does not at all, try to complete the construction of that particular project, or is not, the allottee is not able to live in that apartment due to, lights are not there, staircase is not there. So that is one factor in which the allottee can refuse. But OC is given, that means that the allottee has a duty to make the remaining payment and take the possession of the whole apartment. I think, yes, that's it. This was the overview of the real estate laws in India. I have tried to keep it very precise and give you an overview of some important laws which I think one should be aware of.
Thank you, ma'am, for an insightful session. Now we open up for the question answer round. The participants are welcome. They can write their questions in the chat box. till then, I have one question for you. Ma'am, this problem is in every major city. If you look at Delhi, Bombay, or Bangalore, Hyderabad, Calcutta, ma'am, there are some unauthorized colonies. So initially you talked about protecting interest of the seller and the buyer. And
Yes.
how can we do so? There are certain laws. But if I talk about Bombay itself, I don't know the exact situation of Dharavi, but Kandivali area where there are kholi systems. And I'm sure that is not authorized by the government. So how do you protect the sale purchase there? Because there are families who have spent generation in one particular kholi and now they are willing to sell. So the kholis are very old. Now they are selling it to new people. So, but there are no papers, there's nothing to claim that this kholi belongs to you or you have made such payment or the kholi belong to so and so person, because there's no registration process for that. So how do you protect the interest of the buyer and seller in that situation?
It's a very good question, actually, but are you aware of the SRA Act, like Slum Rehabilitation Act? So, when you talk about any particular, what do we call, state, if I'm talking about Bombay for that matter, the catch of the real estate is all the laws depend upon the area of the land that you are talking about. Now, for example, just to give you an understanding, what I mean by that is if you talk about the Bandra area, the Bandra comes under the MMRDA Act. Whereas if I'm talking about Kandivli area or that side, MMRDA Act does not apply to that particular area of lands or plots which are involved in the purchase or selling or leasing out. So, like firstly, you need to understand what are the laws relating to that particular area of land. And secondly, if I'm correct, I understand the aspect that you're saying is where there are slums and there is no any particular registration or authenticity of the documents. If I'm correct, if I understand what you're saying. Now, if you only mentioned that sale purchase is still happening. Ideally, due diligence is the first step when you are actually investing into a property. But what happens in this extra, apart from these matters, is negotiations form a very base of that sale purchase transaction, because people have lands wherein they have lost the title document because it belongs to a lot of years earlier and they have lost it. So what does usually a seller give? A seller gives an indemnity or a representation either in the particular document that if some third person comes to us and claims the title over that particular property, I am giving you a representation that I am the legal and lawful owner of this and so property. I have had this property for so many years. I will be attaching whatever documents that I have. I'll also be attaching, the Sadpara or the property tax which I'm talking about. Now, I understand in rural areas it's very difficult to get this particular property verification receipts or something. You can always take an indemnification or a representation from the seller ki if this so and so goes wrong, you will be responsible to clear out the mess and I won't be incurring any losses. And generally what I've seen is people are okay with the representation. Like if the seller is telling me ki if someone else claims the title to the property, I am taking the representation that I will be personally dealing with the legal dispute which is happening by my cost. You don't have to spend a penny. I am giving you this representation, and people generally function and buy the property. So this is what I have seen. I hope I was able to address your question, Abhishek.
Yes, ma'am. Thank you. Now, Rajat, if you could read some of the questions from the chat box.
Certainly, Deepak. Thank you so much. Ma'am, I take this opportunity on behalf of all the participants to thank you for sparing your time out of your schedule and guiding us on this important topic. The first question for today is from Subodh Kadam. So his question goes like this: in these COVID times, due to the delay in the formalities of the bank, I, as a consumer who had applied for a loan, couldn't clear it, and there was a delay for the sanction of the loan, thus resulting in delay of the EMI, which was supposed to be paid by the bank to the developer. In this case, can the developer levy a penalty on me? If he does, do we have a defense against it? So this is the question by Subodh Kadam.
Okay, thank you for the questions, both. I think one key component I would like to mention here when you're talking about real estate transaction is, the rights and the liabilities are always recorded in a document. That's why the Registration Act comes into picture. So any particular transaction, if I am to comment upon it, it would be just like a general information which I would be spending even without knowing the facts of that particular case. Now, given the fact that you are saying that during these times, firstly, I think negotiations should be done with the developer, how he is proposing to go ahead with it, because pandemic is something which should ideally not affect the contractual obligations of the parties, but in some cases it might. Now, for us to give you an example, now leave and license, what is happening is the lessors are asking for the payments, whereas the lessee is asking to not ask them for not charge them for the 3 months, for example. So what they are doing is they are coming to a practical solution, that is, they are having negotiations, they are settling in between them, and then trying to rule out the extra what do we say, extra fights or something which might arise in future. So I am not sure. I think you can try talking to the developer and try explaining the situation, how, why, and how this happened. And in this case, can the developer level? I think it would already be recorded in the transactional document which you might have entered into with the developer, and also the remedies will also be given in that particular document.
Ma'am, just furthering on the question, how does the concept of force majeure have an impact? Do you think that is a valid defense that can be taken by either of the party?
If you know the Delhi High Court judgment, it has mentioned that the force measure. Now, if I'm talking very specifically about the leave and license agreement, because this is a very easy concept to explain for me to you. Now, what happens is, you being a lessor, being a landlord, you ask me to pay the rent, and I am not at the position to pay the rent to you because I have not occupied the premises due to the pandemic, correct? But the contractual obligations do not say that. What the contractual obligations generally record in an agreement is, if the premises are rendered unusable for your use and occupation, then you will not be liable to make the payment for that particular time. But in this case, what is happening is, the premises are fine. Just because there is a lockdown nationwide, how does it affect your contractual liability? It doesn't, because it's not my fault that there is pandemic, correct? But the contractual obligations which are recorded in a document are always like that if the premises are unusable, then you don't have to pay. For example, it burned down or any natural calamity happened, and generally the catch is force majeure clause, a standard clause, usually does not include pandemic. So, it always includes floods, rains, earthquakes, but it does not include pandemic because it is something related to human. So in law, when I'm talking about real estate sector, firstly, you need to see the obligations between the two parties. And secondly, force majeure does not affect the contractual obligations between the two parties. So it won't affect the rent paying capacity, or asking for the rent by the landlord is very legal, and he is under the lessee is under the obligation to pay the rent. So it does not impact much, looking from the contractual obligation point of view.
Certainly, ma'am. Thank you so much. The next question is from Priyam, and this question goes like this. Ma'am, what if the OC is received, but the occupier is not provided with what was actually promised, and in that case, refuses to occupy the same? In such a case, I cannot be barred under refusal by the occupier, right?
Certainly. Okay, here are again different aspects. Now, what happens is, I'm not sure if you mean what was actually promised. I'm assuming if I had promised you 800 square feet of a flat and I'm providing you 700 square feet of a flat, under RERA, that is very unlikely to happen because, as I mentioned, registration of a project is very compulsory. So when a promoter registers, he also submits the car parking plan, he also submits the sanction plans, building plans, everything is already submitted. permitted. And due to some reasons, if he is not complying with that particular plans, the OC, the completion certificate, that is CC, after the construction is completed, CC certificate is issued. The CC will not be issued, and the OC is very likely to get, because the construction commencement certificate will have the specification the construction is not in accordance to what is submitted accordance to the plan. So in case the builder has not constructed in the conformity with the plans which is provided or which is promised to you under the agreement, certainly the occupier has the legal right to refuse, because that was not what is promised to the occupier, that is the lottie, and the agreement would form the basis of an evidentiary support, because it will record what the developer has to provide and what he is not under a legal obligation to provide.
Thank you, ma'am. And the next question is from Naresh. And if one party files in Consumer Forum and another party files in RERA Authority, then which is the judgment that will be applicable?
Initially, the case wouldn't go ahead, because the other party, if you are calling me to Consumer Forum and I have filed it in a RERA Authority, the RERA Authority, if is giving the notice to the other party is likely to, kind of say, I have already filed it in the Consumer Forum. So the date on which the complaints are filed will definitely matter. And usually the jurisdiction of other forums, as example Consumer Forum is not part, but again it will depend upon the case of facts and circumstances of the each case. But you also need to take into consideration the date on which the complaint was filed, what is the nature of the complaint, because RERA Authority, why it is in existence in the first place, to reduce the load of the other courts, to make sure that the people who are coming to RERA have only one problem relating to the either a lottie or relating to the with respect to the developer, if developer has done something, or if a lottie is not being okay with following the contractual obligations. So RERA is something ideally people would actually opt for, because it is the main authority dealing in the same kind of matter. But again, it will depend on facts and circumstances of the case.
Certainly, ma'am. Next question is from Aniket. And suppose the construction work for a project has started and later on the environmental clearance is denied, then what will the developer do in such a case?
For example, if an appropriate authority is denying any permission, it will also mention why the environmental clearance is denied. How can you if you can rectify it? Yes, how can you rectify it? And conditional clearances are issued subject to certain conditions. This are the reasons you have been denied, but you can rectify it by following so and so conditions. Like if you breach any of the conditions, your clearance would be revoked. Like this happens in any of the clearances in general. And now what will the developer do in such cases? Again, it would also come with a conditional clearance, which will mention some conditions that have to be complied with. If they are not complied with, then it will be revoked. But some areas come under CRZ areas, where in construction it's not permitted. So if your area falls within that CRZ area, then you wouldn't be issued a environmental clearance due to some environmental laws. Basically, it depends upon the area that you are also talking about. I gave you an example about the CRZ area.
Yes, ma'am. Thank you so much. The next question is from Priyam again, and he asks, also, is there any bar upon up to what time period is the builder allowed to keep the property to himself after the OC is issued? Or is he liable to sell within a fixed period of time?
Generally, you have a time bar to sell the particular projects, but at times what happens is, for example, if you're taking pandemic into consideration, it has affected the selling capabilities of any project in the market due to the downfall. And right now, people are not buying, people are not selling, because everyone knows the market is bad. So usually what happens is, once the builder, if you must have seen, right, a lot of billboards are there, like whenever a project developer is constructing a particular project, he starts advertising it after, of course, registration, but he starts advertising it, and he always gives the buyer an allotment letter. What is an allotment letter? In that, a 10% of the amount is taken from the buyer in order to invest into the project and also move ahead with the construction. I have not seen a case wherein a building is completely developed, OC is also received, and the developer keeps it to himself, because there is so much amount of money, huge amount of money which goes into the project. And if you're aware of, once the payment or the allotment amount from the allotee is received, that is also put into construction of that project in the furtherance, because the developer keeps needing money for day-to-day activities. Where is he going to get money? Of course, he has a finance backup, but the money also comes from the people who are buying the project. And under RERA, there is this concept of 70-30 ratio, in which the 70% of the amount which is taken from the allotee has to be invested into a corpus fund in a bank, and the 30% is supposed to be used for the day-to-day transactional activities with the laborers or any clearances. If money is required, that 30% the developer has to spend, but that 70% has to be in par with the construction that is taken place. For example, he cannot keep withdrawing the amount and the construction is not going ahead. He has to keep the records of the book. He has to keep a record where the money is invested, how the money is invested. So, in a way, it has added to the transparency factor which I talked about, and also the allotee is aware of the fact where the money is going if the developer is investing into it. I hope I am able to cover it.
Yeah, certainly. Anand Singh asks, what are the penalties that a real estate developer would face if he fails to adhere to the registration mandates or any other directions prescribed by RERA?
Anand, if you see the RERA Act, there is a provisions of penalties and offences which are committed by the developer. It depends upon what particular offence are you talking about. Now, registration being the primary step, if a building is not registered, it does not fall within the ambit of the registration real estate project in the first place. Because if any building is constructed, I need to see if the building is a real estate project, yes or no. If it is a real estate project, meaning that I am developing with the intention to sell, then the RERA Act applies. So, registration, agar registration nahi hai, so there are again few penalties. There are like a lot of sections, because then he'll be levied with a fine or an imprisonment up to 2 years, again depending how much has he advertised it, or what are the steps he has taken into consideration. Generally what happens is, when people are investing nowadays, there is a lot of awareness. They always ask for the registration number, and if it is not registered, people don't go ahead with investing into such projects because they are not valid under law.
Thank you, ma'am. Now we won't take any further questions due to paucity of time. We are already running late, and ma'am has been kind enough by extending the time and making sure that all the questions are answered. So I formally invite Abhishek Bhushan Singh, Managing Director, Nyaya Shastram, for the vote of thanks.
Thank you, Deepak. Good evening, everyone. It is an honor for me to express my gratitude to everyone present here. I, Abhishek Bhushan Singh, on behalf of Team Nyaya Shastram, would like to thank Ms. Utkarsh Sanikam for accepting our invitation and to conduct this session out of her busy schedule. I would like to thank my co-founders Deepak Thakur for taking care of all the technical things so that we could facilitate the webinar in the smooth way, and Aniket Datta, who from the past few days have working day and night to make this webinar and other events successful. I would be failing in my duty if I don't thank our media and design team comprising of Palvinder Mahal and Nafis Mustafa for providing the logistics in time, Pratiksha, Head of Program Strategy Department, for promoting the event, and my entire team working day and night in making the event successful, and also enabling Nyaya Shastram to become one of the fastest growing law blogs in India. I would like to thank Rajat, who helped us in promoting the event further and for moderating the session. I would like to thank our board of advisors who always motivate us and guide us through our endeavors. Last but not least, Mr. Anand Singh, who inspired me to arrange for this webinar and supporting for all the endeavors I undertake and for attending it despite of his busy schedule. Thank you so much, everyone.
Thank you so much, Abhishek, for inviting me, and thank you so much, team, for conducting such a successful webinar. I hope it was informative. And students, please reach out to the team for the PDF. I hope you keep it for your information and record, and feel free to get in touch if you have any other further questions. Thank you so much once again, team.